Hey folks, this is Don Graves, president of the Housing Wealth Institute. I'm so glad to have been able to talk to my good friend David McKnight, author of The Power of Zero. Hello folks, this is Don Graves, president and founder of the Housing Wealth Institute, and I've got my good friend David McKnight, author of The Power of Zero, on the line with me. Hey David, how are you doing?
Hey, Don, I'm great. Thanks for having me.
Fantastic. David, I want to ask you a few questions. And because, I'm thrilled and excited always to talk with you. So let's jump right into it. For a long time, you've been raising the warning cry about the fiscal trajectory of our country. How would you characterize the current financial condition of our country, and what are the biggest challenges?
Yeah, notwithstanding what politicians may tell you, the fiscal condition of our country is tenuous at best, and that's driven by a couple of different factors. Primarily, the federal government has promised way more in Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, these so-called entitlement programs, than they could possibly afford to ever deliver. So just to give you a sense of this, Don, back in 2010, we had about $10 trillion of debt. Here we are about 12 years later, and we're closing in on $31 trillion of debt. But that's only the beginning of the story. As we march forward in time, we are going to start adding $2 trillion of debt to the total national debt. But that sort of obfuscates the larger problem. The larger problem is that we have unfunded obligations that really paint a completely different picture than what the national debt paints. And I like to quote a guy named Dr. Larry Kotlikoff out of Boston University. He's the foremost expert in the world on what we call fiscal gap accounting. And what he's done is he's projected out over the next 75 years everything that we promised to pay for Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, interest on the national debt, costs of running the federal government. And then he projects out over that same time period what we can actually afford to deliver under today's tax rates. And he says, look, if you have a difference between those two numbers, then your country has a fiscal gap. And that's a true national debt. He says true national debt is not 30 trillion. It's not even 120 trillion like some people believe. It's much closer to 239 trillion, which means, Don, that we would have to have $239 trillion sitting in a bank account today earning treasury rates to be able to deliver on everything we promised that we can't afford to pay. And how much do we actually have? We actually have negative 31 trillion. So we have politicians that are quibbling over the cost of the Inflation Reduction Act or Build Back Better plan or what have you, but that really obfuscates the larger problem facing our nation is that we are quickly going bankrupt to the tune of trillions of dollars per year. And the only way that we can really fix this sort of seemingly intractable problem is to raise taxes and raise taxes in dramatic ways on not just rich people, but on hardworking Americans like you and me who are, have worked hard our entire lives that will end up eventually giving away half of what we earn to the federal government to be able to shore up all of these entitlement programs. So that's sort of the fiscal trajectory of our nation. It's not pretty. And every year that goes by where Congress fails to permanently fix Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, the problem snowballs, and the fix on the back end is going to be even more draconian, even more aggressive, and it's going to be even more difficult for everyday Americans to have to deal with.
David, is there a day of reckoning that Americans should worry about? Given some of the things you just said, seems like this keeps getting kicked down the road, but is there a point where it can be kicked no longer?
Yeah, a lot of people are worried about this date of January 1st, 2026, which is when the Trump tax cuts actually expire. I'm not so much worried about that because, back in 2017, when we had the previous tax rates before Trump enacted his Tax Cut and Jobs Act, it wasn't the end of the world. The rich were paying 39.6 and the rest of us were paying, an effective rate of about 18%, not the end of the world. We're going to be going back to that starting in 2026. That's not the day of reckoning for our country. The real day of reckoning, I believe, is when the federal government can no longer procrastinate raising tax rates. And I believe that's going to happen in 2030. There's a very famous economist by the name of Brian Boileau. He is the He basically is an advisor to a lot of the top Fortune 500 companies, and his job is to predict the economy, even 10 years out. And he's been doing this successfully with a 95% accuracy for the last 40 years. And he has looked at the debt trajectory. He's looked at the trajectory of baby boomers marching out of the workforce and onto the rolls of the entitlement programs. And he's looked at the trajectory of interest rates and the economy and all that. And he basically says there's going to be this perfect storm, this convergence in 2030 where it all hits the fan. And he predicts that there will be not just a recession, but most likely a depression in 2030 that will last a couple of years because we are not taking these difficult issues head on. So that's the real day of reckoning for our country. It's not 2026. So I would say, you know, Americans, you got 8 years to get your financial affairs in order. And that means shifting your dollars, shifting your hard-earned retirement savings into tax-free retirement plans that are immune from the impact of rising tax rates.
What about people who say David McKnight is a fear-monger? He's just making up these things to sell books to get people in his special program. No one else is raising these type of alarms like this. What do you say to people who call you a fear-monger?
Well, it's like David Walker, former Comptroller General of the federal government, says if they think this is fear-mongering, they haven't studied history and they're not good at math. The truth is, Don, that more and more experts are starting to come over to my camp. In fact, there's very, very few experts that are not in my camp at this point. I'll give you an example that's sort of a funny little anecdote. There's a guy named the White Coat Investor who is the bane of a lot of financial advisors' lives because he basically says, you don't need a financial advisor. And so he doesn't like financial advisors. He doesn't like life insurance. He doesn't like annuities. He doesn't like a lot of the solutions that we hold out to our clients. And back in 2014 or so, he wrote this scathing critique of the Power of Zero, wherein he stated David McKnight is a fearmonger. He's a tax fearmonger. He thinks that tax rates are going to go up. And the truth is tax rates ebb and flow over time. This is just part of our country's history. And you should not be doing a Roth conversion. Roth conversions mathematically don't work out for you in the long run. David McKnight is a scammer, so on and so forth. Mm-hmm. Well, in the lead up to Joe Biden's election, he was tweeting about Joe Biden's tax proposal. And he says, look, this tax proposal reads like an all-out war on the individual investor. You know, you've got all of these different taxes that are being imposed. He goes, if Joe Biden gets elected, he goes, I'm going to convert every last dollar of my IRA to a Roth IRA all in 1 year. And of course, I tweeted my little response that said, I'm glad to see you're coming around, at which point he blocked me.
Oh, gosh.
So the point is, even the most dire, critics of this tax-free paradigm, this idea that tax rates down the road are likely to be higher than they are today, they're all starting to come over into my camp. So there's very, very few people that are left in the camp that say that tax rates aren't going up. So I may have been a tax fear-monger 10 years ago, but right now I'm pretty mainstream.
Your book, your best-selling book, The Power of Zero, resides on my shelf back there next to my wife's picture, and I've highlighted it and read and cut it up. My favorite page begins on page 81, where you do a case study, and I love it. But for those who may not know, what is The Power of Zero, and why did you write the book?
So the Power of Zero refers to the 0% tax bracket, which is this idea that when you're in retirement, you are off the IRS's radar. And people say, well, how is that even possible? How could somebody be in the 0% tax bracket? Mm-hmm. You're probably a pauper. You're not making any money if you're in the 0% tax bracket. And the reality is, if I had $1 billion, I could convert every last dollar of it to a Roth IRA. And when I retire, I can take all that money out tax-free and be in the 0% tax bracket. So the 0% tax bracket refers to a financial state of being in retirement wherein you don't pay tax. And I love to say that the 0% tax bracket is really powerful because if tax rates double, 2 times 0 is still 0. So it's not right for everybody. I don't think everybody necessarily needs to get to the 0% tax bracket, but in the right circumstances, these types of strategies can really work well in shielding you from the impact of higher taxes.
David, we're doing a webinar coming up soon where you're going to be teaching about the Power of Zero concepts. Now, many people have heard you speak before, and what is going to be different about this upcoming webinar? Say that they just heard you 12 months ago. What can an advisor and or a consumer expect to learn this year in this upcoming webinar?
Let me make thanks for asking that, Don. I'm going to make a couple of points. Number one, most people need to hear my presentation 3 different times to fully absorb everything that I'm saying in there, okay? Because there's a lot coming at you. The second thing I would say is that the economy is dramatically different now than it was a year ago. Interest rates are climbing. What does that mean? That means that the cost of servicing the national debt is climbing, which means that the likelihood that tax rates are going up is even more real than it ever has been. And so we're just in a different economic environment today than we were back then. And so I'm going to be talking a little bit about how we can talk to our clients in this rising interest rate environment and why that's so different than what we were experiencing before.
Fantastic. We look forward to it. Hey folks, this is Don Grace. I've been with David McKnight and we had a fantastic time. Many of you will be on the webinar in a few weeks. Some of you will miss it. We'll be watching it afterwards. But David, thank you again for being my guest.
It was my pleasure. Thanks for having me.